There's a question that sits underneath almost every conversation about narcissistic cruelty, one that rarely gets asked directly because the answer feels too uncomfortable to sit with. Why does he actually want to hurt you? Not why does he hurt you as a side effect of getting what he wants, which is the explanation most people eventually accept and move past. Why does the hurt itself specifically seem to matter to him? Why does he seem at times to actually want your pain, not simply tolerate it as collateral damage on the way to something else? This question deserves a real, honest answer, because the comfortable version that he's simply careless, simply selfish, simply too focused on his own needs to notice the damage he causes, doesn't actually explain everything you've witnessed. It doesn't explain the specific timing of his cruelest moments, the precision with which he seems to locate exactly what will wound you most, the way his eyes sometimes seem to hold something closer to satisfaction than indifference in the exact moment you're visibly hurting. Today, we're going to examine this directly because understanding the real mechanism behind this desire changes everything about how you interpret what happened to you. Let's start with something crucial to dismantle before we go any further. The assumption that hurting you and loving you exist in simple opposition. That if he wanted to hurt you, this somehow proves he never loved you at all. Or conversely, that if he loved you, the hurting must have been some kind of aberration rather than something genuinely connected to how his psychology actually operates. Neither of these framings captures what's actually happening, and understanding the real mechanism requires holding something more complicated. That for a narcissist, causing you pain often serves a genuine psychological function, one entirely separate from love or its absence, one that explains why the cruelty could coexist, confusingly, alongside moments of apparent genuine affection. Remember something we've discussed extensively throughout previous conversations about the hollow core at the center of narcissistic identity, the absence of a stable, internally generated sense of self, replaced by a psychological structure that depends almost entirely on external material to feel coherent and significant. We've discussed how this need for external material explains his hunger for attention, his need for admiration, his dependence on you as a source of regulation and validation. What we haven't fully examined yet is how this same hollow core also explains something considerably darker. Why causing pain, specifically, sometimes becomes one of the most reliable tools available for temporarily filling that emptiness. Here's the mechanism worth understanding in detail. A narcissist's sense of power, his sense of significance in the world, depends heavily on evidence that he can affect other people, that his actions matter, that he isn't simply invisible or interchangeable in the lives of the people around him. Positive attention provides this evidence beautifully when it's available. Admiration confirms his significance, affection confirms his impact, agreement confirms his importance. But positive attention isn't always available, isn't always reliable, isn't always producible on demand, the moment his internal emptiness starts to feel unbearable. Pain, by contrast, is remarkably reliable. Causing someone visible distress produces immediate, undeniable evidence of his own significance and power, evidence that doesn't require the other person's genuine goodwill or cooperation in order to materialize. He doesn't need you to admire him in order to make you cry. He doesn't need your genuine affection in order to make you afraid, anxious, or desperate for his approval. Pain can be produced unilaterally, on his own timeline, using tools he's already perfected, which means it becomes an especially attractive option precisely during the moments when his own sense of significance feels most fragile and most urgently in need of confirmation. This explains something that confuses so many people throughout narcissistic relationships: the specific timing of cruelty, the way it so often arrives not during genuinely difficult circumstances that might reasonably produce frustration, but during moments when his own internal stability feels threatened for reasons that might have nothing directly to do with you at all. A bad day at work, a moment of comparison with someone else's success, an internal insecurity triggered by something entirely unrelated to your relationship, any of these can create the specific kind of internal emptiness that pain, deployed against you, temporarily resolves. Here's a second related mechanism worth understanding, one that explains why the specific quality of his cruelty often felt so calculated, so precisely targeted at exactly what would hurt you most. Remember what we discussed in our earlier conversation about why narcissists bring up your most humiliating moments, the way vulnerable information you shared in trust gets cataloged and eventually weaponized. This precision isn't accidental, and understanding why it develops reveals something important about the actual function this specific kind of cruelty serves. When a narcissist causes you generic, unfocused pain, the evidence of his own power and significance remains somewhat diffuse. But when he causes precise, specifically targeted pain, striking exactly the vulnerability you trusted him with, using exactly the words most likely to destabilize you completely, the evidence becomes considerably more potent. It confirms not just that he can affect you, but that he understands you intimately enough to affect you with surgical precision, which provides a more concentrated, more satisfying confirmation of his own significance than generic cruelty ever could. This is why so many people report a specific disorienting quality to narcissistic cruelty that distinguishes it from ordinary anger or ordinary insensitivity. The sense that he seemed to know exactly, precisely, which words would land hardest, and chose them deliberately rather than simply lashing out in generic frustration. This precision isn't cruelty for its own aesthetic sake. It's cruelty calibrated for maximum psychological return, maximum confirmation of his own power and relevance, extracted from exactly the intimate knowledge you shared with him because you trusted him enough to be vulnerable. Here's a third mechanism worth understanding, one that explains why this need for your pain often intensified, specifically during periods when you were pulling away, growing more independent, or showing signs of genuine emotional distance. Remember what we discussed in our conversation about the narcissist's favorite time to attack, the way cruelty so often arrives precisely when your own emotional withdrawal begins to solidify. This timing connects directly to the mechanism we're examining today, because your withdrawal represents a genuine threat to his access to positive attention and validation, which means pain becomes an increasingly attractive substitute exactly during these periods, precisely because it remains available even when your genuine goodwill has started to disappear. This explains something crucial: why his cruelty often seemed to escalate rather than diminish during periods when the relationship was genuinely struggling, when you'd expect someone who valued the connection to try harder to repair it through kindness rather than through increased harm. From his psychological perspective, though this rarely operates at a fully conscious level, causing pain during exactly these moments serves a function positive engagement can no longer reliably provide: immediate, undeniable confirmation that he still matters, still holds power, still has the capacity to affect you deeply, even as your genuine investment in the relationship visibly, undeniably diminishes. Let's go deeper into a fourth mechanism, one that explains something particularly disturbing but important to understand clearly: why some narcissists seem to derive something closer to genuine satisfaction, even pleasure, from witnessing your pain directly, rather than simply using it instrumentally to restore their own sense of significance in a more detached, mechanical way. Remember what we've established about how a narcissist's psychological architecture depends on external material to generate a sense of self that his own internal world cannot reliably produce. For most people, watching someone they claim to love suffer produces genuine distress, an automatic empathic response that makes deliberately causing pain feel aversive rather than satisfying. This empathic braking system is precisely what narcissistic psychology often lacks in its fully developed form, not because he's incapable of any emotional response at all, but because his capacity for genuine empathic attunement to your specific internal experience was never adequately developed in the way healthier attachment allows. This absence matters enormously for understanding the fourth mechanism, because without this empathic braking system functioning the way it does in most people, Watching your visible distress doesn't automatically trigger the discomfort that would otherwise prevent someone from continuing to cause it. Instead, your visible distress registers primarily as information about his own impact and power. Information that can feel genuinely satisfying to receive, precisely because it confirms something his hollow internal architecture desperately needs confirmed, that he is significant enough, powerful enough, relevant enough to produce this magnitude of reaction in another human being. This is worth sitting with directly, because it explains something that so many people struggle to reconcile about their own experience. The specific memory of a look on his face during a moment of your genuine pain, something that felt closer to satisfaction than to the guilt or discomfort you might expect from someone who claimed to love you. This memory isn't a misperception or an unfair, overly harsh interpretation of an ambiguous moment. It's often an accurate read of something genuinely present in that interaction, evidence of exactly the mechanism we're describing today, one that operates independent of whether he consciously recognized or would ever admit to what was actually happening inside him in that moment. Here's a fifth mechanism worth understanding, one that connects to something we discussed extensively in our conversation about the one betrayal an empath never forgives, though it operates somewhat differently in this specific context. Remember how deeply narcissistic psychology depends on maintaining narrative control, on being perceived, both by you and by the wider world, in a way that matches his carefully curated self-image rather than the more complicated, less flattering reality underneath it. Causing you pain, particularly pain significant enough to destabilize your own sense of confidence, judgment, or self-worth, serves a specific function related to this narrative control. It makes you less capable, at least temporarily, of maintaining clear, confident perception that might otherwise threaten the story he needs maintained about who he actually is. Think about what genuine, undamaged confidence and clarity in you would actually threaten. A partner who trusts her own perception completely, who isn't destabilized by doubt or diminished self-worth, is a partner considerably more likely to notice inconsistencies, to hold him accountable, to eventually recognize patterns that his narrative depends on remaining unrecognized. Causing you pain specifically targeted at your confidence, your self-trust, your sense of your own worth doesn't just provide the significance-confirming function we discussed earlier. It actively undermines your capacity to see him clearly, which serves his narrative control considerably more effectively than simple neglect or indifference ever could. This explains why so much narcissistic cruelty specifically targets exactly the qualities that would otherwise protect you from him: your confidence, your self-trust, your clarity about your own worth, and your own perception of events. This isn't coincidental. It's precisely because these qualities represent the greatest threat to his continued narrative control, which means undermining them serves a dual function, providing the significance confirmation we discussed earlier, while simultaneously reducing your capacity to eventually see through the performance he's maintaining. Here's a sixth mechanism, one that helps explain something particularly confusing about the timing and intensity of narcissistic cruelty. The way it often seems to intensify specifically in response to your own genuine happiness or success, something we examined in detail in our conversation about it never being random. Remember the mechanism we traced there. Your independent joy represents a direct threat to his psychological centrality, revealing that your capacity for contentment doesn't actually require his involvement. What we can add to that understanding now is this: causing pain during exactly these moments doesn't just reassert his relevance, it also produces a particularly potent form of the significance confirmation his psychology craves, because disrupting genuine happiness, rather than simply disrupting neutral or already difficult circumstances, demonstrates a more dramatic, more undeniable form of power. It's one thing to affect someone who's already struggling. It's another thing entirely to reach into someone's genuine joy and successfully dismantle it, and this more dramatic demonstration of impact often provides more concentrated psychological satisfaction than causing pain during already difficult circumstances ever could. This is worth understanding clearly because it explains something that likely felt deeply confusing and cruel throughout your own experience. Why your happiest moments so often seemed to become his opportunity rather than something he could simply share in or celebrate alongside you. This wasn't because he was incapable of recognizing your happiness. It was because your happiness, precisely because it was genuine and independent, represented exactly the kind of target that would provide maximum psychological return once successfully disrupted. Here's something crucial worth addressing directly before we move toward what this understanding actually means for your own healing. None of these mechanisms function as excuses, and understanding them accurately should never translate into softened judgment about what you actually experienced. Every one of the mechanisms we've discussed today explains why this cruelty happened from a psychological perspective, without in any way suggesting that this cruelty was acceptable, forgivable, or something you should have anticipated and simply tolerated as an unavoidable feature of loving someone with this particular psychological structure. Remember what we discussed extensively in our conversation about the disrespect that should never be forgiven. Understanding a mechanism accurately and excusing the behavior it produces are two entirely separate things, and conflating them serves neither genuine understanding nor genuine healing. You can hold complete, accurate comprehension of why he needed to cause you pain while simultaneously maintaining complete, unwavering clarity that this need never obligated you to continue providing him with the material to satisfy it and never diminish the genuine wrongness of what you experienced at his hands. This distinction matters enormously for how you carry this understanding forward because there's a specific trap worth naming directly here. The temptation, once you understand these mechanisms clearly, to develop a kind of clinical detachment from your own pain, treating what happened to you as simply an interesting case study in psychological mechanism rather than something that caused you genuine, significant harm, deserving of genuine grief and genuine anger. Understanding why he needed to hurt you doesn't require you to minimize how much that hurt actually cost you, how much of your own confidence, your own self-trust, your own capacity for uncomplicated joy was genuinely damaged by someone whose psychological architecture required exactly this kind of damage in order to feel momentarily, temporarily whole. Because here's where this understanding actually needs to lead, and it's worth being direct about this, rather than leaving the conversation suspended in psychological mechanism without ever addressing what it means for how you actually carry this forward into your own healing and your own life. The first thing worth understanding clearly is what this entire framework actually does and doesn't explain about your own experience. It explains the mechanism. It doesn't explain why you specifically were chosen as the person this mechanism got directed toward. And this distinction matters enormously because so many people, upon understanding exactly how deliberately and precisely their pain was engineered, immediately begin searching for what made them the ideal target, what quality in themselves invited this specific kind of calculated cruelty. This search misunderstands something crucial we've traced throughout many previous conversations in this series. You weren't selected because of a flaw. You were selected most likely because you possessed exactly the qualities: genuine empathy, genuine capacity for trust, genuine emotional depth, that made your pain particularly rich material for exactly the psychological function we've spent this entire conversation examining. The very qualities that make you a genuinely good, deeply feeling person were precisely what made your specific pain so uniquely useful to someone whose own psychological architecture required this particular kind of fuel. This reframe matters because it dismantles a specific, corrosive belief that so many people carry after these relationships end. The belief that something about their own vulnerability or trust was inherently naive, inherently a mistake, inherently something to be ashamed of or permanently guarded against in every future relationship. Your capacity for genuine vulnerability was never the problem. It was simply the exact quality that made you valuable to someone whose need for exactly this kind of material was never actually about you as an individual person, but about a structural deficiency in his own psychology that would have found some other target, some other vulnerable trust, some other genuine capacity for connection to exploit if you had never entered his life at all. Here's the second thing worth understanding clearly, one that addresses something we touched on but deserves more direct attention here: the specific grief that comes from understanding these mechanisms fully, a grief distinct from the grief of losing the relationship itself. Understanding that your pain served a genuine, specific psychological function for him, rather than being simply an unfortunate side effect of two imperfect people struggling to communicate well, requires confronting something considerably more uncomfortable than ordinary relationship disappointment. It requires accepting that the person you loved, at least in some significant portion of your interactions together, was orienting his behavior around a need that had almost nothing to do with your actual well-being, and in fact required your suffering as a kind of ongoing, renewable resource. This grief deserves space rather than being rushed past in favor of quicker, more comfortable resolution. It's genuinely different from grieving a relationship that simply didn't work out due to incompatibility or circumstance. It's grief for having been, in some real sense, used as fuel for someone else's psychological survival. Grief that requires acknowledging a level of calculation and instrumentalization in your suffering that most people never have to confront in their relational history. Give yourself permission to feel the full weight of this specific grief rather than immediately moving toward the more comfortable, more resolved sounding conclusions we'll discuss next, because rushing past this particular grief tends to leave it unprocessed, resurfacing later in ways considerably harder to manage than if it had been genuinely acknowledged from the start. Here's the third thing worth understanding, one that circles back to something we've emphasized throughout many conversations in this entire series, but that bears repeating with specific relevance to everything we've discussed today. Understanding why he needed to hurt you does not obligate you to extend him compassion at the expense of your own continued protection, and it certainly doesn't require you to remain available for continued harm simply because you now understand the psychological machinery behind it. Comprehending a mechanism with clinical precision and extending ongoing access to the person operating that mechanism are two entirely separate choices, and conflating them represents one of the most common, most costly mistakes people make after developing exactly this kind of psychological insight. Some people, upon understanding narcissistic psychology this thoroughly, begin to feel a kind of misplaced obligation toward continued patience or continued explanation, reasoning that since his cruelty stems from genuine psychological deficiency rather than simple malice, perhaps this deficiency deserves more understanding, more tolerance, more continued investment than they'd previously been willing to extend. This reasoning represents a genuine trap, one worth naming directly and dismantling completely. Understanding why a wildfire burns doesn't require you to keep standing in its path. Understanding why he needed your pain doesn't require you to keep providing it, regardless of how sympathetically you might now understand the psychological architecture that created this need in the first place. Here's the fourth and final thing worth understanding: the piece that ultimately matters most for how you move forward from everything we've discussed today. This understanding should function primarily as protection for your future, not as ongoing analysis of your past. Because here's what becomes possible once you've genuinely integrated everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation. You develop the capacity to recognize this specific mechanism far earlier in any future relationship, long before years of investment make its eventual recognition as costly as it likely was this time. Watch in any future connection for whether someone's engagement with you intensifies specifically during your own moments of struggle in ways that feel less like support and more like satisfaction. Watch for whether cruelty, when it occurs, seems calibrated with unusual precision toward exactly your most trusted vulnerabilities, rather than emerging from generic, unfocused frustration the way ordinary human conflict typically does. Watch for whether your own confidence and self trust seem to specifically, consistently decrease the longer you're in someone's presence, rather than growing the way genuine, healthy connection should naturally allow it to grow over time. These patterns, once you understand the mechanism behind them clearly, become considerably easier to recognize in real time, protecting you from investing years into a relationship built on exactly the dynamic we've spent this entire conversation examining.